Hi, I'm Tim Gillingham, your host for Gold Tips Arrow University. Today we're going to cover, how to select and build an arrow for indoor archery. There's a lot of theories on this. There's a lot of opinions on this, but I'm going to, kind of cover my experience as running the national shooting staff for Gold Tip and what my shooters are doing and what we're doing, successfully in the field. Now, it's really not that complicated. Compound bow with a release is the primary thing we're covering here. We will touch briefly on how to, select an arrow for fingers, but it's a little bit more complicated. With a release aid, because we have virtually no knock travel issues with a compound bow that's tuned properly, we can get away with shooting a stiff arrow. Now, a lot of people wonder, well, why is the XXX arrow only offered in a 150 spine? Well, the reason is because, frankly, we feel like there's really no need to offer a whole bunch of different spines, with today's compound bows. So for example, guys get really confused. They are shooting 60 pounds. They come over here and they're going to shoot a 29-inch arrow. And it says zone 4. Okay, zone 4 tells them 340 spine. But what they forget to read is the note that comes with the chart that says with a compound bow and release aid, it's acceptable to shoot a shaft that is stiffer than indicated by the selection chart. Virtually all of the top 3D events in the country are won with a ultra stiff shaft. And the reason is I think that a lot of archers are finding that you get better dynamic consistency out of it, better durability out of it, and they're finding that there is no downside to it. Now, when building an indoor arrow, the very first thing that we need to take into consideration is what are the rules that we're competing under. Now, there are diameter restrictions in different organizations, and so you need to take that into consideration. There's really only 2 restrictions that you need to be aware of. NFAA competition, IFAA competition, they have a diameter restriction of 0.422, okay? That means 0.422 is a diameter. This XXX shaft maxes that diameter out. The points fall under the configuration designed as the largest, allowable arrow for competition. Now, if on the other hand, if you're shooting NAA competition, that's your USA Archery and most of your international competitions, they do have a diameter restriction, and it's 9.3 millimeters. Now, that's the equivalent of, I believe it's 0.366, and the only arrow in the Gold Tip line currently that will, be legal for that is anything the Series 22 diameter and smaller. A lot of our shooters have done quite well with the Series 22 shaft, and it is a really good choice for that. Now, we are working on some shafts for that particular marketplace that will max that OD out, but currently the Series 22 is the arrow that you're probably going to want to shoot for international competition. So let's get right to building an indoor shaft. Now, there's basically 3 or 4 things that you need to consider, okay? When I go to build an indoor shaft, I'm looking at maximum forgiveness. Now, I have a stiff arrow here, so there's a couple things that I may want to take into consideration because it's a stiff arrow. It may be a little more sensitive in tuning, but if you're running into tuning problems, we're going to cover this very extensively in some videos after this that'll teach you how to paper tune and bare shaft tune your setups. I can virtually bare shaft tune any setup I want based on what I do to the compound bow. I'm actually tuning the bow to the arrow and not the other way around. A lot of old school methodologies teach you to tune the arrow to the bow, and I believe that's not necessarily the best way to go. So first thing you want to do is establish the correct length, okay? There's a lot of controversy on this subject, and my basic recommendation is to cut the arrow 1 inch in front of the rest. So approximately 1 inch in front of the rest. And I virtually have done this for girls with draw lengths of 23, 24 inches with very good results. So if you're a little nervous about that and you got a dozen arrows, you can try them a little bit longer to start with, but my recommendation is going to be to cut them about 1 inch in front of the rest to start with. Now, there are some parameters I look at as far as forgiveness. Speed is one of them. Now, speed, a lot of people think speed doesn't matter indoors. I would tend to disagree. I do think that speed is a forgiveness factor, and you need to take that into consideration. If you're shooting 50 pounds, for example, you might want to start with a 100 grain point in the XXX. Now, that sounds awful light, but that's actually what I use for my ASA competition. I use a 100 grain point in a XXX, and it's a phenomenally good shooting arrow. But for women and for older people that want to shoot 50 pounds, I recommend starting with a 100 grain point. Then what I normally recommend is that you use the FAC system, which is an adjustable weight system, and move 50 grains at a time. Now indoors, in order to see any type of reaction at all, I recommend 50 grains at a time. So you might want to try 100 grains in that point for a week, shoot some scores, get the bow tuned up well. If you're running into tuning problems that you can't figure out, make sure you call us at Gold Tips Customer Service, and you can speak with me personally if you need to, and I can help you walk through how to tune that bow better. But as I reiterated before, just do some experimentation, move 50 grains at a time, try it with 100, try it with 150, and maybe go up to 200 grains and see which gives you the most optimal results. Now, for a shooter that's shooting 50 pounds, we also want to keep the arrow lighter, okay? We want to keep the back of the arrow probably with feathers rather than vanes. The difference in, say, this vane combination and this feather combination is probably about 10 feet per second. These vanes weigh about 9.5, 10 grains a piece. The feathers weigh virtually nothing. They're, maybe a grain or 2 grains a piece. So we're going to pick a little bit more speed up going to the feather over the vane at the lower poundage. Now, one thing I see a lot indoors is guys will shoot small vanes. Maybe they think they look sexy, or heck, I don't know. But there's really no upside for you to use a small vane indoors. You want to go at least a blazer style vane, or a vane like this VaneTech 2-inch HP. But really, there is no downside for going to more vane. I might consider something like this or something like this here for 3D on this big arrow. But for indoor, I typically run 4-inch vanes, and I'll actually run them in a 4-fletch pattern because overkill is kind of the rule. I want it correcting any mistakes I make. What happens when you're dealing with a compound bow and release is the arrow, when you make a mistake, is being hit off of center. So the tendency is to want to push that arrow to the side, and then the point planes off. That's why point weight helps us shoot more accurately indoors, but it also shows the importance of the vanes in stopping that arrow motion left or right, okay? So if we have more vane on the back here and we make a mistake, it's going to be corrected instantly and get this arrow back online faster, okay? Same thing with the reason I teach people to cut the arrow an inch from the rest. If the rest is sitting here holding the arrow and we have a 150 or 200 grain point way out in front of the rest and we make a mistake, the rest does not have as much leverage to get that arrow back in line. So it tends to be a little bit more forgiving setup to have that arrow sitting right there off the trough of the rest, and then the arrow rest has a little bit better chance of redirecting that shaft if you do in fact make a bad shot. Now, if you're a normal sized male archer and you're shooting 60 pounds or 65 pounds, you might consider a little bit different setup than somebody shooting only 50 pounds. Now we really don't have the restrictions of weight. You typically with an average, shooter shooting over 50 pounds, 50 to 60 pounds is the most, mostly the range that most indoor archers shoot. I typically recommend starting with a 150 grain point in this scenario. And then typically take a 2 or 3 week session and just use the FACT weight system again, use a 50 grain weight, shoot this 150 grain point for a week, log your scores, use the weight wrench here and the weight system and add another 50 grain weight to the back of the point, shoot it for another, 3 or 4 or 5 days, log your scores, and then maybe go up to 250 grains. And then by the end of that, 2 or 3 week session there, you're going to know exactly what point weight is going to give you the best results. Now, a lot of people think this is a huge difference. There is very little difference between 100, 150, 200, and 250 grain points. Now, there might be a bigger difference if you've got a clearance problem, but if you'll start with the correct procedure, that we cover later on in the paper tuning and the tuning segment of this video session, you're going to find that you're going to have a lot better results when you're dealing with, making minor adjustments. You're going to see kind of the same results that I see, which is simply that point weight is a very, very subtle change. Okay, as we covered in an earlier segment, there are many knock options available for your XXX or your Series 22 arrows. And you can use the GT pin knock. This is usually quite a very good nock to use indoors. It usually is safe with most indoor bows because they're typically longer axle to axle, lower performance bows, lower speeds, and so it's a very good nock, very popular. A new nock that's real popular is this AccuLite with the unibushing. That's probably my favorite. It's a little more durable over the long run. It doesn't require as much replacement of nock. And then we have the HD pen nock. A lot of shooters using that nowadays also. Just several options available. But the main thing is just get a good tune in your bow. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the Series 22. If you're setting the Series 22 up for indoor competition, for FIDA, there's some slightly different parameters. The largest point weight that it comes with is a 125. You can then add 50 grain weights at a time and do your experimentation that way. I would do it kind of the same way. Most people don't go over about 175 grains, and that's just 125 plus the 50 grain weight. You usually don't need as much vane because it is a little bit softer shaft, but I still recommend, lighter poundage archers go with feathers. Really, overkill is the rule when we're talking about vane drag. Up to the point where you're getting clearance. You got to have clearance. So if you're having clearance problems with larger diameter shafts and feathers, try a 4-fletch pattern off a drop away. I personally shoot a Hamsky drop away so that it allows me to use a 4-fletch pattern. That works quite well for me. It compacts my fletching pattern, but it gives me very, very good steering left and right. You can get away with a smaller vane like this if you like, but really you're not really getting away with anything. So just make sure you use extra vane on your arrows and do some experimentation with point weight to optimize your forgiveness. I hope this segment helps you understand a little bit more on how to set up an indoor arrow and break down some of the stereotypes around stiff arrows. Stiff arrows provide a very accurate arrow. A lot of times I think a stiffer arrow is more optimal for performance simply because we get better dynamic consistency. If you're running into problems tuning, if you're running into problems with forgiveness, make sure you give me a call or some of the other guys at Gold Tips customer service, and we'll help you with any problems that you might have.